Many thanks, Sunil. So with that industry context in place, let's widen the lens. When we talk about travel retail, we often talk about passengers, airports, tourism flows, and consumer trends. But behind those flows sits something bigger, geopolitics. The routes people travel, the confidence consumers feel. The stability of global trade, all of it is shaped by the forces reshaping our world today. And few thinkers have explained those shifts more clearly than our next speaker. Kishore Mahbubani is a celebrated author, distinguished diplomat from the Republic of Singapore, former president of the UN Security Council, a distinguished fellow of Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore, and one of the most influential voices in this field. It is my pleasure to welcome to the TFWA stage, Professor Mahbubani.
Good morning. I'm sure you all agree that we live in interesting times. I'm sure you're waiting for the next tweet, the next announcement. Will a civilization disappear? Will trade stop? So clearly, I can tell you as someone who's been monitoring geopolitics for 55 years, this is among one of the most confusing times I've experienced in my life. And so if you're not confused, something is wrong with you. So my goal is to try and see whether we can find a way out of this confusion and see where we are going on the larger long-term trends. Because at the end of the day, the future of the travel industry will depend on what happens to globalization, right? Travel floats on top of the larger phenomenon of globalization. And the big question of our times is a very simple one. Is globalization a sunrise industry or a sunset industry? And the answer to that question will determine where we will be 10 to 20 years from now in the travel industry and other industries. But the fact that we're even asking this question, is it a sunrise industry or sunset industry, seems rather strange. Because I remember 25 years ago when the 21st century opened, and I used to go to Davos year after year, everyone was celebrating globalization. Globalization was a new dawn in human history. It was going to raise living standards all over the world. And I can tell you, I met all the great gurus of globalization at that time. They were all friends of mine. Tom Friedman, New York Times, who said the world is flat. And you had Martin Wolf of Financial Times. You had Jagdish Bhagwati, a professor in Columbia University. And everyone thought, wow, we live in the best of times. The world is shrinking, global trade is exploding, the world is going to get a better and better place. And that optimism seems rather strange now. It's hard to believe that we were so optimistic just 25 years ago. So what happened? How do we end up where we are today? And the simple answer is that in the last few years, our global system has been hit by several massive shocks. And it's perfectly understandable that these shocks have hurt us and the world significantly. So what I'm going to do in my remarks today is first of all talk about the big shocks to the global system, and then talk about how what the impact was of these shocks and what I see as the future as we look ahead towards the rest of the century. So let me begin with the shocks. Each of these shocks, by the way, has been quite serious. The first one, I'm sure you all remember very well, the COVID shock in 2020. I know it well because I was a very lucky man. I happened to be on a cruise ship in the Antarctic in February 2020. Can you imagine? Probably the last cruise ship went to the Antarctic before COVID shut it down. So I know that moment very well. And then suddenly, out of the blue, the whole world shut down. And I remember for someone like me who traveled every few weeks, it was quite stunning to be in my house for 1 year without taking a flight. But that was a powerful indicator of how fragile our global system is, and a virus could shut down the world. And as you know, even today as we are speaking, I'm sure you're wondering whether any of us in this room has got this, what's it called, Hatuna virus, right? So another virus that's shocking the system. That's one shock. And then last year, we had what you might call the tariff shocks. As you know, President Trump increased tariffs on every country in the world. Every country in the world. And as you know also, what's shocking about that is that until then, the United States had been the leading defender of an open global trading system. And I can tell you, about 40 years ago, I accompanied the then Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when he addressed a joint session of Congress. And he gave a really beautiful speech, which you should go back and read sometime, thanking the United States and saying, thank you very much. You open up the world, you globalize the world, and we have all benefited, and we all prospered. And the lesson was very clear. Countries that opened up, engaged, would succeed. And if you have any doubts about this, just simple case study. Go to the Korean Peninsula. When the Korean War ended in the 1950s, North Korea and South Korea, same economy. Today, where is South Korea? Where is North Korea? Lesson, open yourself up to globalization, do more trade, you succeed, you win. And then suddenly the chief defender of the system says no. That's a big shock, clearly, to the system. And then, of course, you also have something which is called the China shock. It's important to mention the China shock because the reason why there has been a backlash against globalization, especially in the developed countries, in the United States and to some extent in Europe, is because they feel that they cannot compete against China. China has just been massively successful in growing its economy, producing products that are amazingly good, amazingly cheap, and therefore taking away jobs from the developed countries. And that too, as you can see, has caused a sort of sense of disillusionment with globalization. And of course, most recently, we've had the current shock which we are experiencing today, which is the Iran war shock. And once again, you saw from the previous statistics that were read out by Sarah and others, this war has disrupted travel dramatically. And I can tell you, as usual, it affects your own family. In 2 days from now, my wife was supposed to fly to London to see our son in London via Dubai. Now she's going via South Korea. That's an example of disruption in travel that's affecting all of us. So given all these shocks, where are we today? What has been the impact of these shocks? And frankly, given how big these shocks have been, our world should have been shattered by them, right? Should have been broken. And indeed, just take the latest one, the tariff shocks. When President Trump raised his tariffs last year, the Liberation Day tariffs, all the esteemed economists and institutions said, gosh, this is going to damage the world economy. And the IMF said global economic growth will go down. The World Economic Forum said global trade will slow down. Guess what happened? In 2025, the global economy continued to grow. Global trade increased. And what's amazing, this is a small indicator of how resilient our global system is, that by far the most globalized country in the world is the country that you are in, Singapore. Singapore's total trade is 3.5 times the size of our GNP. And if globalization cracks, the first country to feel it will be Singapore. We're so open, right? And Singapore's economy, the forecast was that, oh my God, we'll have negative growth in 2025. And since our per capita income, as you know, is one of the highest in the world at $94,000, for Singapore to get 1% growth, 2% growth is a big achievement. So how did we do in 2025? The most globalized economy in the world? We grew by 5%. If the most globalized economy in the world manages to grow at 5% in a very difficult economic environment, it's an indicator that the forces of globalization are still alive and doing well. And if you look, for example, even at the shock of the current war, Iran war, it has been bad. Let's be clear about it. But that war could have carried on for much longer, because there's no doubt that the United States and Israel had an overwhelming military advantage against Iran. They could bomb Iran anywhere, anytime, and Iran was defenseless. The war could have carried on, but it stopped. Why? Why did the war stop? Because that war was also damaging middle-class households in the United States. Because the price of oil is not fixed locally, it's fixed globally. And when it goes above $100, the guys in Idaho, Ohio, California, when they go to the gas station, they feel the shock. And the fact that they feel the shock because of a war in Iran shows you how globalized our world is. And so that has become a major constraint. And even if you look at, say, the third shock that I mentioned earlier, the China shock, clearly China's emergence has transformed the world. If there's one statistic you should all know, by the way, if you want to know what amazing times we live in, remember this statistic. China's share of global manufacturing in the whole world in the year 2000 was 5%. 2000. 2025, 30%. By 2030, 45%. Now, this is an amazing transformation. And of course, you can point to all the negative effects of these things, but at the same time, China is also producing goods that have benefited the world enormously, especially those in developing countries. And just give you a simple example. A country like Pakistan, right, has to import oil, which has grown very expensive. Those are their oil shortages, energy shortages. But people's lives haven't suffered so much. Why? Very, very, very cheap solar panels from China came in. And guess what? People could get electricity. That's a simple example. And if you go to many developing countries, you'll find over and over again how many of them have benefited from this so-called China shock. And in many ways, China's success as an economy has obviously boosted global economic growth and generated also a global system that has become far more productive. So it is better for the world when big countries like China and India succeed. And I also want to emphasize, by the way, just in case you're surprised that China and India are doing well, one historical fact you should always know is that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So the return of China and India is not a surprising phenomenon. It's a perfectly natural phenomenon, and that's what we are experiencing in the 21st century. So you can see, therefore, that while our system obviously has had big shocks, at the end of the day, our system has also shown resilience. So as we look ahead, what should we expect? What are the future prospects like? And here, I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to try and inject some optimism in where we are today. And the reason why I believe very firmly that globalization is a sunrise industry is because the world has changed structurally. What's that structural change? I explain the structural change with a simple boat analogy. In the past, when humanity, 8 billion people, lived in 193 separate countries, as we do, we live in 193 countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats, right? Each boat had a captain and a crew, and we were separated. And by the way, just to explain why that metaphor is important, if one boat got COVID, another boat wouldn't catch COVID because they're separated. But as you can tell from COVID, we no longer live in 193 separate boats. Humanity now, and I'm not talking metaphorically, I'm talking literally, they live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. The world has shrunk. That's why when one cabin catches COVID, 193 cabins caught COVID because we are on the same boat. So, therefore, you cannot separate humanity anymore. Our destiny is deeply intertwined. And at the same time, just as our physical environment has changed, equally importantly, our mental environment has changed. People all over the world today are instantly connecting with each other. In the past, you had very good telecommunications, very good phones. Today, you have AI and Chat GPT. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It doesn't matter. You get access to the same kind of information. So humanity really has become incredibly integrated with each other. So the idea that you can shut off the world cannot happen. We are on the same boat. And so while there will be temporary retreats occasionally by countries from globalization, most countries realize that you've got to keep opening up yourself to the rest of the world if you're going to succeed. And the idea that you can close the doors to the world can no longer happen. So globalization, therefore, has been structurally plugged into our world, and it will continue to grow. And the result of that is that countries will continue to grow and prosper. Now, you've been talking a lot about the Asia Pacific. Here's one statistic that you should know about what I call the CIA countries. CIA doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, where we are today. China has got 1.4 billion people. India has got 1.4 billion people. ASEAN has almost 700 million people. 1.4 plus 1.4 plus 700 makes 3.5 billion people, almost 40% of the world's population. Now, among these 40% of the world's population, in the year 2000, out of these 3.5 billion people, only 150 million people enjoyed middle-class living standards in the year 2000. But by 2020, that number had exploded to 1.5 billion people. And by 2030, it could hit 2.5 to 3 billion people. And the one thing I guarantee you these new middle classes want to do, remember, it's an increase from 150 million to 3 billion people, middle class. The first thing they want to do when they have access to a little bit of surplus wealth is to travel, see the world, and see what a wonderful world we live in. So I hope at the end of my remarks, you'll feel a little bit more cheered up and not get shocked when you see another shocking headline. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mahbubani. We all need a dosage of optimism. Thank you for sharing your perspective with us today. Just one question before we break for our coffee break. You haven't covered India in your talk. We received the question from the floor in terms of India's ascent. It is the most watched market for the travel retail industry. What is your outlook on India? And what do we often get wrong on India's ascent to the world stage?
On India, right?
On India.
Yeah. Well, I think, because China has been so successful, by the way, I must emphasize this to you all, that what we have experienced with the Chinese growth story is historically unprecedented. Let me just give you it's easy to give you simple statistics. You look, the European Union, as you know, is one of the world's largest economic giants, the European Union. In the year 2000, the European Union was 7 times bigger than China. Today, EU and China, same size. By 2050, EU will be half the size of China. Now, that growth story is an absolutely amazing one. So everyone watches China. But when they all watch China, they forget India. The Indian story is also remarkable. I'll give you one statistic again. As you know, 100 years ago, the British used to effortlessly rule India. 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. And even as recently as the year 2000, the British economy was 3.5 times bigger than India's. Today, India's is bigger than the British economy. By 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than United Kingdom. The century begins, India is 1/4 the size. By the middle of the century, India is 4 times the size. That's an example of a phenomenal economic growth. And you also find, I mean, if you want to, frankly, if you want to go to the most optimistic country in the world and meet some of the most optimistic young people, which is why, by the way, it's very telling that you had a 10-year-old girl from India demonstrating what can be done. And if you look at that young girl and you multiply that hundreds of millions of times, and then you begin to understand what's the potential of India. You can't stop its growth.
If we were to gather in this room 10 years from now, what would you hope we got right? And what do you suspect that we would laugh at ourselves for getting so wrong today?
Well, I think it's understandable why many of us feel pessimistic with all these shocks that are happening, right? And so it's quite natural for people to be very cautious and worried about, should I invest? Should I prepare for a different world, a better world? So I actually believe that we will overcome these short-term shocks. Because at the end of the day, remember that economic theory hasn't changed. Economic theory shows that countries that open up and compete with the rest of the world do very well. And so even though today, temporarily, even if some countries are shutting down, most countries are not. In fact, what's amazing is that after President Trump raised his tariffs on the whole world, no other country in the world, not one, increased their tariffs on the world. That showed to you the conviction of 192 countries that we are still on the right track, despite the shocks that we are having.
Professor Mahbubani, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us and for joining us this Monday morning. We are really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you.